Hello and welcome to Understanding Transitional Justice. Our topic for this week is transitional justice, post-conflict justice in international politics. And what I'm going to be doing this week, again, we're going to do just one segment, which will be sort of longish rather than a number of short ones. And the primary purpose is to raise topics and raise questions that we can then explore further and discuss when we go into our long session. So why don't we begin by talking about ways in which international intervention in post-conflict situations, using instruments of truth-telling and using instruments of law, has become normal, has become conventional. Uh, this is this is probably the main change that we've seen over the last couple of decades. That is that post-conflict justice initiatives are no longer an ad hoc measure, are no longer an emergency measure, but in one form or another have become standard. There are either trials conducted in other countries, commissions appointed, tribunals appointed, or cases run through the International Criminal Court. And one of the things that we see happening in this is that post-conflict justice initiatives tend to become integrated in and tied to the overall goals of post-conflict settlement, often become a part of agreements that end conflicts when they occur. Another thing that happens because of this is that an autonomous professional corps dedicated entirely to post-conflict justice has developed. There is a set of lawyers, a set of investigators, a set of judges, a set of consultants on truth commissions and fact-finding commissions that now go around from country to country to either set up institutions or to offer advice. So this is a more or less freestanding group. It is a specialty that has become global, and there is a tendency for transitions then to be articulated and to be lobbied through institutional and legal means. The legal principles that are applied become an object of negotiation. The standards that are applied become an object of negotiation. This has mixed consequences, and some of these consequences are unintended. So that, for example, some of the more active military forces in the world, and we're talking about military forces of countries like the United States and Israel, have a permanent core of legal advisors that, when they're about to engage in attacks, advise them on the legality or potential legality of targets for activities like bombing. Uh, this can be interpreted different ways. On the one hand, you can say this is wonderful that military forces are using lawyers to advise them so that they avoid violating international humanitarian law. Or you could say that it's a little bit creepy and that it leads to some manipulation of the legal system and manipulation of standards. There has been influence of this practice in some cases that are of concern to us. So that, for example, one Croatian general, Ante Gotovina, was prosecuted principally on the ground that his choice of targets did not exclude the possibility to a sufficient degree that civilian targets, non-legitimate targets, could be hit. And in this, a number of military lawyers from powerful countries became intensely involved in advancing arguments, in submitting a friend of the court brief, for example, arguing that to convict General Gotovina on the basis of this standard would restrict the autonomy and flexibility of military forces of other states in the future. So what I'm saying is that the near universal application of post-conflict justice mechanisms has led to some consequences on the political level and on the military level, which were not predicted and that can be interpreted positively or negatively. A similar phenomenon that we've seen is mixtures in the ways in which the principle of universal jurisdiction, the principle that violations of human rights can be tried in any country, brought to court in any country, are applied. This is a standard that has been proposed, on which there has been a lot of backing down. It's the case that a lot of the principal suspects, for example, in the Rwandan genocide, have been tried in jurisdictions like Belgium or France, places in which there is a strong political influence between these countries and Rwanda, in which there is a large population. Similarly, the current conflict in Syria is seeing the first meaningful cases for violations of human rights being brought in Germany. So the standard of universal jurisdiction is developing. It's developing unevenly, and it's not entirely clear what this is going to end up meaning. Another area in which international politics enters into the administration of post-conflict justice. This is a topic that we have talked about before, that is conditionality, the principle that the provision of aid or membership in international organizations or integration with international institutions will be conditioned on the cooperation of post-conflict states with efforts to establish justice, either criminal justice or truth-telling initiatives. Now, we have already seen the argument, and it's an argument that's advanced by Jelena Subotic among others, about the degree to which conditionality can have the effect of emptying post-conflict justice processes of substance, of turning them into purely formal communication between governments and international institutions. There is another element in which this enters in, that is that if conditionality is going to involve imposition of requirements, eventually there will be political pressure that requirements should be imposed equally or apparently equally on both sides, that is applied to members of all parties in the conflict if there is more than one party. And the impulse to balance derives from the adversarial character of the criminal justice processes, and it leads to, again, some unintended consequences is competition in terms of the numbers of indictments or accusations or demands that can be made, and cheerleading. One consequence of this, the basic problem with conditionality is that some states are more powerful than others. As a consequence of this, it's easier to prosecute losers than winners in a conflict, except it's not always the case that there are clear winners and losers in every conflict, and then the process of post-conflict justice becomes a way in which parties come to be treated as winners, or more frequently as losers. So this is another area in which the international environment has what could probably be regarded as distorting effects on processes of post-conflict justice. Let's move directly to questions around the legal environment and legal processes. To the degree that it is postulated that post-conflict justice involves a set of processes that are designed to advance legal empowerment, especially legal empowerment of victims through the conduct of legal battles, a question is raised, which is, who is it then that is charged with the task of pursuing justice, and who can be relied to deliver it? The answers to this question vary. That is, this question of how people pursue justice in a post-conflict environment. The two routes that are most frequently taken are either one, to begin the process by demanding justice through domestic legal institutions, and if this fails, to try to appeal to an international one, to institutions like, for example, the European Court of Human Rights, which has oversight over decisions that are made by domestic courts in the signatory countries, or second, where domestic institutions fail to rely on international institutions, whether we're talking here about an international tribunal or the International Criminal Court, although it is increasingly the case since the establishment of the first two tribunals in the 1990s, the tribunals for former Yugoslavia and Tribunal for Rwanda, that tribunals are more likely to be hybrid institutions than purely international institutions. And this is because of difficulties that arose because of the purely international character of the Yugoslavia and Rwanda tribunals. Now, we could say reliance on international legal institutions often has the effect of developing domestic legal capacity, but we can ask the question of what domestic legal capacities are developed. Ideally, you would hope that it's the ability of domestic legal institutions in the states that are subject to international oversight to try and prosecute their own cases to a good standard. But very often, this is the capacity to conduct defenses and defenses only, particularly in international tribunals where this is the level on which domestic participants are included. Finally, another point about using criminal law and institutions of criminal law as the exclusive or more or less exclusive avenue for pursuing justice, this leads to a narrow focus on crimes rather than on the needs of victims. And here, if we think of international law as an institution to develop domestic legal capacities, it's also possible to think of it alternatively as an instrument for the development of capacity to meet needs. But this is one of the principal critiques of international legal institutions that develops in domestic cases, in particular in the states of the former Yugoslavia, subject to the oversight of the tribunal, is that what you see is states spending a lot of money on lawyers to bring cases or to provide defenses, and no discernible benefit from this for the domestic publics. So how do we add this all up? Here is a summary of the basic critiques of internationalization of post-conflict justice. First, the criminal context, pursuing cases through institutions and instruments of criminal law, is overly narrow, and it means that that many needs, in particular needs of victims and social needs, and needs to address issues of inequality that are very often the causes of the violence that is conducted, tend to be neglected. So there is an encouragement of this overly narrow, overly formal, and overly professional context over needs in the environment that may take precedence. Second, there is the argument that reliance on international intervention and international institutions becomes a way for domestic institutions to offload responsibility onto them. We ask the question of who is responsible or what really happened. People leading the domestic institutions will say, well, we don't need to answer that question because the International Tribunal or the International Commission is going to answer it. So it becomes a way in which politicians relieve themselves of responsibility. And the reason that this is important then is that the steps that involve dialogue between domestic political institutions and members of the domestic public are very often passed over, so that the anticipated political and social results are not achieved. And then finally, you could make the argument that international intervention in the form of legal activity through institutions of law enforcement and through institutions of judicial process are a crisis response, developed as a crisis response, but that over time they have tended to become a normal one, and that this normalization has had unanticipated consequences. So these are all questions. This is a summary of the general character of critiques of the international character of post-conflict intervention in the field of justice. I am raising these as questions. These are questions that I hope we develop further in the discussion that we carry out during our live session, which I look forward to.